You stand in the year 1453, the streets of Constantinople trembling with the weight of history. Smoke clings to the air like a heavy curtain, drifting from shattered rooftops where the final cannon blasts of Mehmed II's siege have left charred gaps in the skyline. The city groans beneath its own defeat, its ancient walls cracked, its proud banners trampled, its once untouchable pride now reduced to ashes scattered across the Bosporus breeze. You hear the shuffle of armoured boots clanging against cobblestones slick with dust, see horses stamping nervously as their riders raise Ottoman flags on towers that yesterday bore crosses. Bells that once summoned the faithful to prayer now clang with a desperate hollow rhythm, drowned out by the Ottoman drums that thunder through every avenue. You are caught between relief and terror, relief that the cannon fire has stopped, terror that you know exactly what happens next. You've read enough history to know this isn't a fairy tale where everyone is treated kindly after surrender. No, you probably won't survive this, at least not in the way you imagine. And before the silence of midnight sets in, here is where tonight's story begins. What the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors was terrible. These women were not spared. They were not considered civilians in the modern sense. They were prizes, burdens, and political tools, reshaped by policies designed to strengthen empire and weaken resistance. The empire swallowed them whole, and in return they left silent marks on its culture, its households, and even its palaces. If you've ever wondered what defeat really meant for families, you'll see it here, in corridors, harems, and kitchens where history rarely lingers. Now, before we go deeper, let's do something odd. Post in the comments where you are listening from, and what time it is there. It's strangely fitting. Defeated Constantinople had its time zone reset too by whoever rang the bells loudest. The first detail you have to grasp is this. The Ottomans didn't improvise. They had a system, a set of practices that were neither merciful nor chaotic. When warriors fell, their wives and families became spoils of war. This was no different from what medieval Europe practiced, or what Mongol Khans imposed, but the Ottomans perfected the bureaucratic rhythm of it. Wives of defeated warriors were immediately marked as property to be divided, either taken into the service of Ottoman commanders, distributed among soldiers, or marched into slave markets where buyers ranged from wealthy merchants to officials seeking new household labour. Imagine standing in a crowd where an officer is quite literally tallying human beings like sacks of grain, deciding which woman is worthy of palace training and which is destined for drudgery in some Anatolian village. And here's the thing you might not expect. Some of these women ended up in the imperial palace itself, not out of kindness, but because the empire saw value in folding them into the elite system of concubinage. The Topkapi Palace would eventually become home to hundreds of women, many of them captives. A wife of a defeated warrior might suddenly find herself undergoing training in language, etiquette, and even music, preparing to serve as a concubine or attendant. It sounds glamorous in the shallow tourist brochure sense, but in reality, it was a life of surveillance, strict hierarchy, and constant danger. Failed to please, and you were cast aside. Pleased too well, and you became a pawn in dangerous palace rivalries. It's a lose-lose situation, except for those rare few who leveraged charm and wit into power. One or two even became mothers to sultans, shaping policy from behind silk screens. But most, they simply endured. Outside the palace walls, the reality was cruder. The wives of ordinary defeated warriors, peasants and lesser nobles, were relocated as dependents into households of Ottoman soldiers. This wasn't an adoption scheme, it was conquest economics. The empire rewarded its fighters not only with coin but with human beings. A sipahi, Ottoman cavalryman, might ride home from campaign not only with loot but with a foreign woman now called his wife, though legally she was closer to a slave until and unless he decided to formalize her status. For many of these women, their husbands had been executed or enslaved, their villages burned. Now they found themselves in kitchens pounding wheat into dough for men who had ridden through their doorways with torches. You don't need much imagination to see how that plays out. Domesticity under duress isn't gentle, it's survival dressed up in ritual. Another layer to understand is how religion entered this picture. The Ottomans, like many medieval powers, framed conquest in religious language. Non-Muslim captives, especially Christians, were considered legitimate spoils under Islamic law of the time. Wives of warriors fell into this category, and while some were allowed to keep their faith quietly, many were pressured to convert to Islam. Conversion wasn't always forced at sword point, but the pressure was heavy. You gained better treatment, access to certain privileges, and protection if you adopted the religion of your captors. Imagine being told in a foreign tongue that you could have lighter work, fewer threats, maybe even a better roof, if you repeated a few words and bent your head. Survival pushes most people into choices they never planned to make, and here's a detail that makes you sit up. Children were the empire's favourite weapon. If a defeated warrior's wife bore children with an Ottoman man, whether through marriage, concubinage, or coercion, those children were raised as Ottomans. Bloodlines were diluted, loyalties rewritten. It's not just about women losing freedom, it's about generations being reshaped. The empire knew that the fastest way to erase resistance wasn't only by killing warriors, but by absorbing their families. You can see it as cruel genius, or just plain cruelty, depending on your mood tonight. But don't imagine every woman was broken. There are stories, whispered more than written, of resistance. Some wives took their own lives rather than submit. Others escaped into monasteries or fled to sympathetic villages. Some fought quietly within their new households, sabotaging, refusing, teaching their children secret prayers. And yes, a few learned to play the game, becoming trusted companions of Ottoman elites, bending circumstances into something resembling agency. But for every one of those stories, there are hundreds of nameless women whose lives folded into anonymity, their identities erased under layers of empire. The Ottoman system even had its version of sorting. Highborn wives, daughters of nobles, wives of generals, were seen as more valuable. They might be kept as bargaining chips, exchanged for political alliances, or even sent back for ransom. Ordinary wives, however, faced harsher fates, endless domestic labour, field work, or concubinage. The line between privilege and misery was thin, but it existed, reminding you that hierarchy crushes differently depending on where you stood before the war. Step back for a moment and imagine the scene again. A conquered city, a crowd of widows and wives, children clinging to their skirts. Ottoman officials making decisions not in hours but in minutes, assigning fates with a wave of a hand. You might want to believe there was compassion, some soft corner in the bureaucracy, but the historical record suggests otherwise. It was efficient, cold, and deeply systematic. And it didn't end in 1453. This practice repeated itself across the Balkans, in Hungary and Persia, wherever the Ottomans expanded. Each conquest left behind the same silent trail. Men buried in ditches, women repurposed into the machinery of empire. By now you've probably realised something uncomfortable. History isn't just about emperors and battles. It's about the quiet suffering that never made it onto official documents, the lives repurposed without their consent. You can almost hear the footsteps of those women echoing across centuries, not through marble palaces, but through kitchens, nurseries, and back alleys. Their voices were rarely recorded, but their presence shaped entire communities, influencing the very culture of the empire. And that's the terrible truth hidden beneath the banners of conquest. It was built not just on soldiers' victories, but on the forced silences of their wives. Remember when I said you probably wouldn't survive this? This is what I meant. Not survival as in still breathing, but survival as in still yourself. Because what the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors wasn't just about possession, it was about transformation, stripping identities and folding them into a new order. And if you close your eyes right now, drifting into the rhythm of your own breath, you can almost feel the weight of those choices pressing down across centuries. Not a loud history, but a quiet one. The kind that lingers when the drums have long stopped. You left the conquered city with the sound of drums still ringing in your ears, but the story of those wives does not end there. What happens once the immediate chaos of conquest settles? That is where the empire's grip truly shows itself. After the shouting fades, the smoke clears, and the soldiers march on, the women are left to inhabit roles that are not theirs, identities remade according to the Ottomans' needs. The empire did not allow loose ends, and the wives of defeated warriors were considered loose ends until they were reshaped into something useful. The irony here is that usefulness could mean anything from drudgery to prestige. Survival hinged less on personal merit and more on the mood of fate and the hands of the officials who processed them. One of the most common destinations was the household. Picture yourself suddenly carried off to a strange village in Anatolia or the Balkans, placed into the home of a cavalryman who has returned from war. His wife, if he already has one, might resent you. His neighbours might whisper. Yet you are now a part of this household, whether you like it or not. Your duties are not chosen but imposed. You cook meals, draw water, tend to livestock, clean mud-caked boots. You wake each morning to the smell of wood smoke and the sound of hens scratching in a yard that is not yours. This new life offers no room for protest. Your survival strategy is obedience, at least at first. Over time, perhaps you carve out tiny moments of control, slipping food to your children, bargaining for a piece of cloth at the market, whispering prayers in your own language when no one listens. But every act is under the watchful eye of empire. For other wives, the fate was the palace. The imperial harem at Topkapi was not merely a den of indulgence, as later travellers loved to exaggerate. It was a political machine fueled by captives. Women who entered this world were trained like recruits. Imagine waking at dawn to lessons in Ottoman Turkish, Quranic recitation, music, embroidery, and etiquette. The goal was to erase your past and sculpt you into a figure that served the Sultan's household. Your name might be changed, your religion pressed into conformity, your clothing stripped of any sign of your homeland. You are, in effect, remade as a tool of empire. Life in the harem was not automatically luxurious. At the bottom rung you scrubbed floors, laundered clothes, carried trays of food. At the top, if fortune favoured you, you might rise to the rank of Haseki Sultan, a favoured consort, wielding influence rivaling that of viziers. But that ascent was rare, dependent on wit, beauty, and sheer luck. And even then, power came at a cost. Rivalries were fierce, punishments swift, and the walls of the palace doubled as a prison. You lived among gilded cages surrounded by silks and jewels, yet freedom remained a ghost that never walked through the courtyards. The wives who never saw palace walls often faced harsher forms of exploitation. Slave markets thrived in cities like Bursa, Edirne, and later Istanbul. Women captured in wars, wives, daughters, mothers, were sold alongside young boys destined for military training. The markets smelled of sweat, leather, and dust, a place where human worth was reduced to bargaining. Buyers inspected teeth, skin, and posture, making judgments in minutes that determined the course of a lifetime. For a wife of a warrior, this was not just humiliation, it was a complete erasure of the role she once held. Yesterday she was someone's partner, today she was a commodity. And yet, in the strangest twist, some women managed to climb through this system. Take the example of Roxolana, also known as Hürrem Sultan. Once a captive, she became the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent and wielded extraordinary political power. Her story was exceptional, but it revealed a paradox. The very system designed to strip wives of their identities occasionally created women powerful enough to shape the empire itself. These rare stories offered a glimpse of agency, but they also served as propaganda. Look, the empire seemed to say, we elevate those we conquer. For every Roxolana, there were thousands who scrubbed kitchens until their hands cracked. The Ottomans also weaponized marriage. Some wives of defeated warriors were given as brides to Ottoman allies, tribal leaders, or soldiers as a way of cementing loyalty. Picture being marched into a tented encampment, introduced as a gift from the Sultan to a loyal vassal. You smile because you must, bow because you must, and your very presence is a political token. These marriages blurred the line between personal and imperial interests. You were not a bride, you were policy in human form. Religion again marked the path of survival. Conversion often smoothed the way. A Christian wife who became Muslim could secure a better standing in her household, sometimes even inherit property or pass rights to her children. But conversion was rarely just about belief. It was survival dressed in the robes of faith. You muttered the new prayers, you learned the rituals, you bowed when others bowed. Yet late at night, you whispered the old words in secret, clutching memories of saints or crosses, or songs that no one else in your new world understood. Dual lives became common, outward conformity, inward defiance. The children born from these wives became both a lifeline and a chain. Sons could be raised within the Ottoman system, sometimes even entering the Janissary Corps, a military elite formed originally from Christian captives. Daughters often followed their mothers into servitude or marriage within Ottoman households. For the women, children were hope, proof that life continued, but also a painful reminder of conquest. Your child belonged to a system that had destroyed your old world. You loved them, but they no longer belonged entirely to you. The empire had its hands on them from the moment they drew breath. Social survival required cunning. Some women aligned themselves with other captives, forming networks of solidarity inside households and palaces. They shared stories, taught each other languages, guarded each other's secrets. Others learned to manipulate their positions, feigning loyalty to earn lighter burdens or better treatment. And yes, some simply shut down, surviving day by day without hope of anything beyond the next sunrise. History often forgets that endurance itself is a form of resistance. To live, to keep breathing under such circumstances, was itself a refusal to disappear. The Ottomans saw all this as ordinary. To them, wives of defeated warriors were not individuals but resources, tools to stabilize society, reward soldiers, and integrate new populations. The terrible part is how normal it became, how quickly extraordinary suffering was folded into the paperwork of empire. Bureaucrats recorded names, markets exchanged coins, households absorbed new members, and the system rolled forward. Generations grew up never knowing any other arrangement. What shocks you today was the wallpaper of life for centuries, and yet through this machinery cracks always appeared. Some women escaped, slipping away through sympathetic networks of Christians or Jews, hiding in monasteries or villages. A few managed to ransom themselves back to their families. Others used wit and alliances to claw their way upward, carving space for influence even within gilded cages. Their voices are faint in the archives, but they are there. Letters, petitions, whispers that survived against the odds. When you pull back and look at the big picture, you see both tragedy and transformation. The wives of defeated warriors were broken, yes, but they also changed the empire. Their languages, food, songs and customs seeped into Ottoman life. The lullabies they whispered to their children carried echoes of distant villages. The meals they cooked blended ingredients from conquered lands with Ottoman tastes. Even in silence, they reshaped the culture that oppressed them. The empire swallowed them, but in turn, they flavoured the empire. So as you drift tonight, remember that conquest was never just about cities and walls. It was about people remade against their will, leaves folded into new systems, stories swallowed by official silence. The Ottomans did terrible things to the wives of defeated warriors, but those women endured, and in their endurance they left invisible fingerprints on history. Their lives remind you that the quietest actors often leave the deepest marks. Now breathe slowly. Let the noise of the markets fade. Let the palace walls dissolve into the night. You've walked through kitchens, harems and marketplaces where history whispered in the voices of captives. Close your eyes and listen to those voices echoing not with screams but with the rhythm of survival. The drums are gone now. The only sound left is your own steady breath, soft and enduring.